Well, one simple message is that central banks, although they're supposed to be totally trusted and totally reliable, actually on their own probably can't deliver the kind of price stability that they managed to deliver over the last 20 or 30 years. That sometimes you have these shocks that come along that upset things, lead to misinterpretations in terms of what policy should be doing. And once the misinterpretation comes along, then you actually got a big problem with inflation. So going back to 2020, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this huge monetary expansion. I mean, absolutely off the charts of what you normally see. And this was justified because the pandemic was all about a collapse in demand. We discovered in hindsight that it wasn't about a collapse in demand as much as a collapse in supply. Big loss of supply, big rebound in demand later on, huge monetary expansion. Not that surprising, frankly, that we've ended up with a lot more inflation than the vast majority of economists anticipated.
So you've gone back a little bit further than 2020, I understand. In fact, stick a couple of noughts on. You've gone back 2,000 years. I mean, I know this is it's a bit of an indulgence, but we're on a Friday, so give us the best example of where the central banks have, I was going to say cocked it up, but I can't say that on air, so mucked it up, just did. Where kind of the best historical example of where the central banks thought they could control it and really failed dismally.
Well, of course, most of the time there aren't any central banks. It's all about sort of being on the gold standard or a silver standard or something like that. But I suppose the 1970s is the most obvious example of where things go horribly wrong. But there are also
where they just didn't go long enough, didn't stay the course.
All that sort of stuff. But also, throughout history, there's a very close relationship between what loosely described as monetary policy and fiscal policy. That the idea that somehow monetary policy and fiscal policy are separate from each other, they're totally independent, is frankly nonsense. And what typically happens is that governments eventually run out of money. You know, government debt is too high. They eventually find some way or another to either debase the coinage or to print money one way or the other. And I think that QE, for all of its benefits at the time when we had the global financial crisis coming out of it, the fact that it persisted for such a long time may have meant that governments themselves were probably far too relaxed about adding to government debt.
Jeff and I were in Davos, I reckon 2016, it must have been Axel Weber, he of UBS, said the medicine will kill the patient. I remember him clearly saying that to us, and like, obviously, roll forward another 7 years, and the medicine's been going on most of that period as well. Is the medicine killing the patient? But we just don't know it yet.
Well, I think part of the problem with QE was the fact that you're basically nationalising bond markets. Now, bond markets have a very, very useful role to play when you've got inflation, which is they're an early warning indicator. So it's a bit like sort of having an enemy bombing raid and you turn off your radar systems. You can't see the bombers coming along. So effectively, it's the same thing. You nationalise the bond markets. Bond markets can't respond to initial increases in inflation. By the time that central banks spot it, it's too late, which is exactly what I think has happened over the last 2 or 3 years. So effectively, you've got a situation whereby they should have been raising interest rates much sooner than they did. And when they finally got round to raising interest rates, they didn't really want to admit that they themselves had made an error.